Hey everybody, Tony D back with another video on screenwriting tips. Today we're going to talk about writing a supernatural screenplay. Okay, let's define our terms here. What is a supernatural screenplay? That is a screenplay that has the supernatural elements in it. That includes things that aren't science fiction-y. Take them out. You're basically taking out the fantasy stuff. When you're talking about supernatural, it's not fantasy. So we're talking about, ghosts, vampires, horror-related stuff generally. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a horror movie. There's plenty of supernatural dramas. Plenty of supernatural comedies, definitely. Even supernatural crime stuff when you get right down to it. But it's going to have that element of monster that's not quite scientific. I mean, there might be some science fiction-y elements to it in that if you look at a movie like, what was that movie? Gosh, I should look up the names before I shoot these dumb videos. It's the movie with the lichens and the vampires were fighting. It was vampires versus werewolves. And so, here's an easy one, Blade, right? So you got Blade the Vampire Hunter. It's a supernatural movie and an action movie, but it has a little bit of that science fiction-y element in that Blade's weapons need to be kind of super powered to fight all the vampires, right? So it sort of kicks up the horror element to the action element of it. So that's what we're talking about. Basically, monsters. Monsters being used as fantasy or science fiction is used as a metaphor to tell a story. Okay? So I've written a lot of these. I like a lot of supernatural stuff. I like to do the vampire thing. I've done at least 2 vampire screenplays. And, it's fun to play with the rules of the vampire. One thing you should definitely do is your research, because that, as I always say, can be very inspiring. Like, for one of the vampire movies, I used a vampire from a different culture. And that has different rules. And I said this in a video before. If you just go on the internet and look up vampires, that aren't Romanian in origin, you're going to get all kinds of crazy stories about crazy vampire monsters that, they're nothing like the Western vampires, nothing like them. They do very strange things. A lot of that for me was inspired by role-playing games, because in role-playing games, in the early days of Dungeons and Dragons, they had vampires, but then later they sort of, were trying to add more and more monsters to the game. They started to dig deeper. And so they eventually dug down to some of these other vampires that had a different cultural background. Because they had such wildly different powers, they were a completely different monster, really. And that's what you wanted in the role-playing system. So in the movie, you want to, just like in science fiction and in fantasy, you want to clearly define the rules and physics of your supernatural creature or creatures or whatever. Whether it's a ghost, whether it's a vampire, whatever supernatural entity you're dealing with, you have to make those rules clear, at least in your own head, so they're consistent on the screen. You can always go back and tweak those rules, but they have to be clear to the audience. It's sort of the same thing when you're like shooting a scene and you want the map of the house to be clear to the audience. You want that same sort of clarity when it comes to the rules. Now, you may not get that clarity right away. You may discover that clarity in the course of the discovery of the movie, and that's perfectly fine. But it has to be discovered, and it has to be clear to the audience. It may not be clear to all the characters, certainly. Um, and a lot of times these movies are horror adjacent because monsters tend to be scary. When they're too funny, you get the Monster Squad, which, there's nothing wrong with that, but it kind of takes on a different demeanor if the supernatural elements are so undermined by the comedy that they almost don't matter. I've done other supernatural movies too. Ones with, excuse me, ones with strange monsters, especially, and some of the elements that help validate creatures. Number one is their age. Tends to be the older they are, even if you're making up the monster completely from scratch, the older they are, the more validated they can be. That history helps validate them within the confines of your story. So, if you have a scene in which the characters discover an ancient scroll or an ancient, cave painting, and the monster that you're going to see later is depicted in these ancient works, then later when the monster shows up, that validates it to some degree because it's so old and it's been around so long, and that sort of lifespan makes it a formidable opponent for the characters, whether it's a comedy or a drama or a horror movie. And that's the kind of enemy you want for your protagonist. You want a powerful enemy that, oh my God, it's lucky that the characters beat this guy because he's so old. Because characters that are ancient, and that's what you get to play around with in the world of the supernatural, they have been around so long, they've literally tried everything, and if they've been around in the ancient world, certainly people have tried to kill them time and time again in very direct ways. So it makes for an extremely formidable enemy for the characters. Now, that means your protagonist is gonna have to kick up his game or her game and be smart enough to figure everything out and not just get lucky, but to actually say, okay, how are we going to beat this horrible monster that's been, crawling around these mountains for 1,000 years? You need to answer those questions. The history also gives you a good backstory. You can add other elements to it. You might remember a recent Fox show with the Headless Horseman, which was this crazy Fox show where this guy buries himself in colonial times and then unearths himself in the modern day, and he's got to fight the Headless Horseman and all these crazy supernatural things. It was really a guilty pleasure of a show. I highly recommend it. I forget what the hell it was called, but you know what I'm talking about. It was the show on Fox like a year and a half ago about the Headless Horseman. Great show, lots of fun, made absolutely no sense, but it made sense in the context of the show. And that's all you really need. I mean, supernatural rules are about as loose as you can get, Science fiction rules have to mostly be scientific. So they have to have some scientific basis or they don't work. Fantasy has its roots in historical documents and old stories and stuff like that. So there are usually a few rules to that. Supernatural rules, out of the three, can be bent pretty far. Even with the vampires, you've seen vampire movies where they just bend the rules, or they ignore one kind of vampire rule, and and they just don't even address it in some movies. Same thing with zombies. I mean, that's another example. It's a supernatural thing, the zombies. I think one of the elements of the supernatural is the unknown. You can never really fully understand the supernatural threat, and that's part of its, power, that it's not quite fully understood. even on a show like The Walking Dead, the zombies are not totally 100% known. There's still this element to them that, like, they're a little unpredictable because, you know, on the show, and I could do a whole video about how much I hate The Walking Dead, even though I watched it for quite a while. You know, the show at least revealed things about the zombies that were surprising every once in a while. So, with your screenplay, you're not going to have the kind of luxurious time that The Walking Dead has. You're going to have to reveal that stuff. And you don't want to reveal too much, you know, in one movie. You don't want to get too complicated with the rules of your zombie movie or your vampire movie or whatever, ghost movie, whatever. You want to keep those rules, you know, tight enough so people can get them in a short movie. And you got to introduce those rules probably by midway through the second act. The characters should know the rules, or certainly the audience should. Definitely your protagonist should be figuring out the rules by midway of the second act. If you know, maybe, you know, under extraordinarily good circumstances, you might be able to swing it just in the very beginning of the third act, but definitely, you know, for the climax of the movie, the rules have to be known, you know. Also, it's sometimes good to have red herrings in supernatural movies with regard to the rules. That can help, you know, if you have a situation where the vampires or the zombies or whatever, you know, they're right on the cusp of figuring out how to kill them, and maybe they have a way to kill them in a slow way as opposed to killing them in all one big thing. If you get my drift, you know, the big solution at the end of the supernatural movie, as opposed to a smaller solution that works earlier but isn't the most effective solution yet, let's say. So, and again, you know, with supernatural stuff, you can stretch things kind of like a comedy. Now, comedies just, the reason you could stretch things is they're more forgiving. The reason you could stretch stuff with supernatural stuff is because the audience can't really overrule you in a supernatural movie. They can't, you know, stand up and say, well, that's not how ghosts work. Everybody sort of defines their own rules in terms of the ghost in a supernatural movie. In another movie like a drama or a mafia movie or someplace that some movies that are more reality based, yes, the audience can, you know, stomp their foot down and go, wait a minute, this isn't what happened, or this isn't the way it would work. But in a supernatural movie, you make the rules. So as long as you make the rules work within the context of that 90 or so minutes, you're fine. So the supernatural threat, you follow the 3-act structure. In the first act, generally you're going to introduce the protagonist. Generally it follows, hello little Joan, speaking of protagonists, give me a kiss, okay. You're generally going to follow the 3-act structure. You're going to introduce the protagonist in Act 1, and they are going to have a sort of a near miss with the supernatural element, whatever it is. It may be barely perceptible to them, almost normal, but something's definitely up. In the second act, you're going to kick it up, and by then, the supernatural part of it becomes evident and just heightens. So typically in a vampire movie or a zombie movie, more vampires get created, more zombies get created. In a werewolf movie, the werewolf kills more people. In a ghost movie, more strange things start to happen. You know, the house starts to exhibit more and more strange things. In the third act, everything comes to a head, And whatever that metaphor is for your supernatural thing, whatever it is, has to come out. So if the zombies are a metaphor for consumerism, as they were in the old George Romero movies in Day of the Dead or Dawn of the Dead, when they're trapped in the mall, at the end of the movie, you're going to get sort of the heightening of that. And the heightening of that was, in Dawn of the Dead, the people get away from the mall, leaving the zombies to wander around in this mall where they're still playing music. And, they're almost no different than when they were alive, kind of thing. So that's part of the statement in Dawn of the Dead. Dawn of the Dead is Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead. They're really two movies that they're horror, but they're also funny, and they're also kind of fun. So they're not just horror movies. I mean, Dawn of the Dead is kind of a satire too, in its own way, and there's also funny moments in it, even though it's kind of scary. Zombie movies themselves have been so overdone. They almost are, they're a joke at this point. It's funny that the Walking Dead TV show became so popular because, as a movie, they had done just about everything with zombie movies. They were all kind of the same, and they're all sort of variations on the theme. Not that I don't love them. One of my favorite ones is Juan of the Dead. If you haven't seen that one, it's a Cuban zombie movie. It's a lot of fun. Train to Busan, which is a Korean zombie movie. Highly recommended. It was very good. And again, it was like Train to Busan, Korean zombie movie, was very interesting because there was a lot of drama in it. A lot of drama, a lot of action, a lot of supernatural stuff, a little bit of comedy, but not a lot. Definitely very intense, and there were definitely scary moments, but they were scary like a roller coaster scary, not scary like, horror movie scary, which I think is a different kind of scare. And I think supernatural movies tend to lean towards roller coaster scares. So they're not scares like, oh my God, we're all going to die scares, like ghost movies might be, or that demon movie whose name I can't remember. They're more towards like, oh my God, look out, kind of scares. Like the movies where all the teenagers defy death, and then they defy death in the beginning of the movie, and then death tries to kill them for the rest of the movie. So when you're doing a supernatural movie, part of the reveals, part of when people die, it all has to be very strange. It can't just be scary. It also has to be strange, ironic, usually is a component of that. So you don't want to just kill people. You want to kill them in a way that, they shouldn't have died, but did anyway, or you kill them using their greatest fears against them. That's another thing too. You don't have to have one of my supernatural screenplays, and it's kind of a horror movie. It's not, there's no ghosts in it, there's no monsters in it. It's just weirdness. It's a weird movie. I don't want to go into my screenplay, which I'm still trying to sell, but you have a component that's just, there's one moment where it's sort of explained, but it's a world that I made up the rules. So as long as I make up the rules and as long as they're consistent, that works. And when I say consistent, it's movie consistent, right? So in the movies, if you have pirates, movie pirates look like pirates, You don't have time to be nuanced unless, the whole movie's about pirates. Really, if you're doing movie pirates, you go big or you go home. That's what you kind of have to do with mostly everything in movies that isn't, unless you're doing a very nuanced drama piece or whatever, you need to go big. And with supernatural stuff, by midway on the second act, I mean, it's just got to be crazy town. Just got to be crazy town. The supernatural elements start to overtake the movie, and then they come to a climax in the third act. The supernatural being is defeated, usually using his own, powers or words or magic against him. And then the climax is he goes away or is defeated or is killed, and your protagonist goes on to live a happy life or, is okay for now. Is this the end? ... Or everybody dies, like in a zombie movie. That's what's so great about a zombie movie. Like, you kind of go into it knowing everybody's going to die, or most people are going to die. And that's okay, unless you're doing some kind of crazy zombie franchise. It tends to be a little nihilistic, zombie movies, but that's the fun of them. They're just fun B-movie stuff. Monster-wise, like if you have a monster like Godzilla, that sort of borders on the disaster movie front, where the threat is so big and large, everybody's impacted in a wide radius. Maybe I got to do a separate video on disaster movies, which kind of aren't in vogue anymore. But I think supernatural stuff is, the urban supernatural movie is very much in vogue these days. The kind of movie that takes place in the modern day and is very, very subtle. Like, It Follows, where it's like, yeah, again, that's a movie that kind of makes up the rules. And you could take, an old wives' tale and like Candyman's kind of like that. He's sort of like the boogeyman. Say his name and in the mirror and he reappears, that kind of thing. And again, it's very important for the Candyman, the rules in that movie. So get your rules. All right, so number 1, do your research. Number 2, figure out your rules, your supernatural rules, very important. And number 3, of course, 3-act structure. And whether you border on the horror, or comedy, or some other genre, do all that other stuff first before you launch in to the regular stuff. And I would also say that the supernatural element as a genre of movie is a movie you should probably only attempt. So like if you're going to cross over supernatural with, say, action, you should probably do an action movie first before you try to incorporate, action and supernatural. You should probably do, really there's no pure supernatural movie. Maybe you could say horror is, but, because there's definitely going to be some scares. But if you're going to take the supernatural element and apply it to something else, whether it's a period piece, a lot of times it's a period piece, you really should think about writing just the pure period piece to sort of get the feel for it before you do the supernatural period piece, which would be more complicated, because if you do the period piece, you've got to get the period correct. People have done, ones where they weren't quite correct, but if you're trying to do your best work, you got to do your research and you got to do your legwork. And I think doing a screenplay that's with fewer elements in it, because I think supernatural is sort of like the icing on the icing of the cake, you really ought to get that under your belt before you start tying it into all sorts of cross genres. And maybe I should do a video about cross genres. Genres. Thank you. Okay, That's it for screenwriting tips today. I hope you have enjoyed it. I know Joan has enjoyed being scratched. So check me out on Patreon, The Webcomic Factory, and Superfrat. My name is Tony D. Good luck writing your screenplay.